Part three, the ancestors are calling me, calling us. I haven't decided yet. Ancestors calling us. I like that. Ancestors calling. Part three. We left talking about the Church of Scotland, and the Church of Scotland was established by John Knox, and John Knox was commissioned or licensed by Edward the Sixth, who was the son of Henry the Eighth, the son of Henry the Seventh, who took over the Plantagenet cadet branch of the Lancasters, as we see here, as regard of the what we call the Second 100-Year Wars, which were a bunch of serious wars that took place in 1688. Okay, in 1688, right? I don't like bringing it up like that, but like I said, our brothers and sisters comprehension level is so low that I got to do it. Okay, so we was talking about uh, left off talking about once again the Church of Scotland. Okay, Church of Scotland founded by John Knox, and John Knox was commissioned by Edward the Sixth, who was the son of Henry the Eighth, the son of Henry the Seventh, the founder of the House of Georges, who took over our state. Right? Let's connect the dots. Church of Scotland. Now, why I'm coming here? Why am I coming here? We can thank Archbishop for this. Guardian. Okay? We are your guardians, y'all. Archbishop is your guardian. Who else is presenting this information? As the guardian of the people, the king's consciousness. Guardian is a news article, right? Slavery. This article is about slavery, right? About slavery done by the Free Church of Scotland, started by who? John Knox, who was licensed by who? Edward the Sixth, who was son of who? Henry the Eighth, who was son of who? Henry the Seventh, who took over our state. Okay, which led to what we call the Second 100-Year War, as well as what we call the War of the Roses. Right? Very simple. Free Church of Scotland under fire for failure to apologize over slavery money, assets. Church statement expresses regret that members took money from plantation owners in 1844, condemned as shameful. Frederick Douglas demanded that the church send back the money when he toured Scotland in 1846. Photographed by George Kendall Warren Ruler. Okay? Did y'all hear that? All right? Frederick Douglass demanded that the church send back the money when he toured Scotland. This was published the 23rd of May this month, 2024. Y'all hear that? The Free Church of Scotland has been accused of shameful behavior after its refusal to apologize for receiving money from slavery worth millions of pounds today. The Free Church is known to have accepted donations from plantation owners in the southern United States soon after its foundation in 1843, and then a significant bequest from a wealthy Glasgow, Glaswegian or Glasgow sugar baron 10 years later. After coming under intense pressure to address its slavery inheritance, the Free Church issued a short statement on Wednesday night, which said it recognized and freely admits the historical sins of members of the denomination in relation to slavery. It said, we acknowledge with sorrow and regret and grief that a delegation of its members took money from Southern plantation owners on a fundraising visit in 1844, but stopped short of apologizing. To the dismay of some of its members, the church also said it was unlikely to still be the beneficiary of those funds because of property transfers with other denominations over the last 180 years. To the dismay of some of its members, the church also said it was unlikely to still be the beneficiary of those funds because of the property transfer with other denominations for over the last 180 years. Its fundraising from Southern slave owners was notorious at the time after the emancipated anti-slavery campaigner Frederick Douglass, who demanded it send back the money when he toured Scotland in 1846, addressing a large crowd. All right. His statement did not mention a large known gift and received it from slavery derived wealth of 18,000 bequests from James Irving, a rich Glaswegian who had slave plantations in the Caribbean in 1853. Okay, do y'all hear this? Historian Anthony Cook has found that money was used to build churches and two free churches, training colleges in Edinburgh and in Glasgow. Building the church said it's no longer owned. Building the church no longer owned. Dr. Stephen Mullen at Glasgow University wrote in 2022 that it was powered by wealth derived from West Indian rather than American slaves. Andrew Baker, a recently Edinburgh-based opera singer whose forebears were enslaved in the United States, who had previously challenged church leaders over the denomination, said that the response was a shameful prevarication. All right. It was absolutely despicable that the church also prepared the chattel slavery of the United States and Caribbean with modern day slavery and trafficking in the state. Did y'all hear that? Did y'all hear that? All right. This is the Church of Scotland. All right. The Church of Scotland. We already know the history regarding the Church of Scotland. All right. Now this is in regards to a claim against the Church of Scotland. All right. And under the spirit and in the spirit of Frederick Douglass. All right. All right, so let's move from there. We see what Frederick Douglass said about the Church of England, okay, as well. I mean, the Church of Scotland. You see what Frederick Douglass said about the Church of Scotland. Now, why would he say something about the Church of Scotland, and why would the Guardian be raising the issue about the participation that Scotland had in slavery, i.e., the Church of Scotland created by John Knox, and John Knox, who was licensed by Edward VI, the son of him, Henry VIII, the son of Henry VII, who stole the Plantagenet estate by way of conquest. All right, why? Why would they be making these statements? Let's see why. First, let's look at Recorder of Deed, right? Why would they be using Frederick Douglass, right? Why? In regards to the wrong that was done to slaves, they're using Frederick Douglass and using him to validate the justification for reparation, reversion, and remandment of the states as a result of the history in regards to what they done to those who participated in the slave trade. Okay? It's right here. Recorder of Deeds or Deed Registry is a government office tasked with maintaining public records and documents, especially records relating to real estate ownership that provide a person other than the owner of a property with real rights over that property. And that includes slaves. Okay? That includes slaves. The office with similar duties varying by jurisdiction includes Registrar General, Registrar of Deeds, Registrar of Deeds, Registrar of Deeds, Registrar of Deeds, Registrar of Titles. The office of such an official may be referred to as a deed registry or deeds office. In the United States, Recorder of Deeds is often an elected county office and is also called the county recorder. In some United States, functions of the Recorder of Deeds are a responsibility of the county clerk or the county clerk of courts, and the official may be called clerk recorder or recorder clerk. Did you hear that? All right, which Frederick Douglass was in the position of, right? Now, Frederick Douglass is arguing about an estate that belongs to the inhabitants of those territories that were subject by way of what we call acquisition or prescription of sovereignty. All right, acquisition or prescription of sovereignty. How do I know that? Frederick Douglass on this frequency, the frequency we are on in this present day. All right, and he didn't have the tools that we have today. All right. And look how much progress he had just not freeing himself, but enlightening the people with the information needed to free themselves. Okay. We must understand that. Let's see what we're working with, y'all. It said that the Church of Scotland was owned by a Glaswegian known as James Ewing. All right. Let's see who this guy is real quick. It's always good to know your slave owner, right? James Ewing of Stratford. Okay. James Ewing of Stratford was Lord Provost of Glasgow. All right. Of Glasgow. MP for Glasgow, a plantation owner, slaveholder, and West Indian merchant. Okay. You gotta hear that. So that was his skill, slave trade. All right. He's from Glasgow, a Glaswegian. So let's take a look at Glasgow. Okay. Let's look at Glasgow. Let's look at the history of Glasgow. Following European Protestant Reformation, and with the encouragement of the Convention of World Berbers, the 14 incorporated trade crafts federated at the Trade House in 1605 to match the power and influence in the town council of the early merchant guilds, who established their merchant houses in the same year. Glasgow was subsequently raised to the status of a world burg in 1611. Okay, Daniel Defoe visited the city in the early 18th century, famously opinion in his book A Tour Through the Whole Isles of Great Britain. that Glasgow was the cleanest and beautifulest and the best built city in Britain. London accepted it. At that time, the city population was about 12,000, and the city was yet to undergo the massive expansionary change to the economy and urban fabric brought about by the Scottish Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. Did you hear that? The Industrial Revolution. The city prospered from its involvement in the triangular trade and the Atlantic slave trade that the former depended upon. Did you hear that? Glasgow merchants dealt in slave product cash crops such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and linen. All right. This is why Frederick Douglass took his stand. All right. This is why Frederick Douglass took his stand. This is why we should be taking our stand and our fight for the return of our state. All right. That's why we should be doing it. All right. So we read it right there. All the other stuff is irrelevant. Go ahead. Why is this important and why Dred Scott took the stand, his position? Why? Let's see. I already talked about this already. Honey, I got to go do it again. Let's start with the departure, what the Guardian magazine said. This is most needful because they don't know this. Marking the 200th birthday this week, I wanted to acknowledge the depth legal historians owed to Frederick Douglass when Chief Justice Roger Taney denied that free Black Americans were citizens of the United States in the 1857 Dred Scott decision. Douglass immediately opposed him. Then, across his lifetime, Douglass never forgot how Taney had used his high court to demean African Americans from the podium in the pen. Douglass made a recorded that his endured that has endured and thus ensured Dred Scott will be long remembered as the lowest point in the history of race and law. Did you hear me? Talking about the Dred Scott case will be a low remembered as the lowest point in the history of race and law. Why? Because it's from that we're going to take our stand. Okay? We're going to come back to this article, but let's go to the Dred Scott case because this is why Dred Scott took this is why Frederick Douglass took his stand, and this is why we're taking our stand as on the same frequency, under the same history, as well under the same spirit. All right. We are on the same frequency with Frederick Douglass, who is of Anglo-Saxon fraternity. Okay. First, let's go to the Dred Scott case. Since Frederick Douglass said, Douglass made a recorded that he endured, thus Douglass made a recorded that has endured and thus ensured Dred Scott will be long remembered as the lowest point in the history of race of law. Okay? We must understand that. Why? Let's see. How many of y'all talking about this? Dred Scott case. This is the Dred Scott case. In deciding the question of slavery, we disclaimed the influence of the general principles of liberty, which we all admire and conceive it ought to be decided by the law as it is, and not as it ought to be. Slavery is sanctioned by the law of the state, and the right to hold slaves under our municipal regulation is unquestionable. But we view this as a right existing by positive law. Quite so, okay? Positive law of a municipal character without foundation in the law of nature or the unwritten and common law. Did you hear that? So their law is based upon positive law. Now I was watching a video by Todd Sariq talking about natural law is positive law. He don't have a clue about natural law or positive law because positive law is contrast to natural law, which is the unwritten law, which is the common law that was created by Henry II and was existed before his descendants, going back to what we call time immemorial. Because we just seen in 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica, written by Scottish monarchs, say that the Anglo-Saxon nationality existed since the Stone Age. Okay, since the Stone Age, and it said that they had the uncoded Magna Carta and the government of Wittemont, which means Witten, which means wise men or wise counsel. Okay, but this is the Dred Scott case that Frederick Douglas had a problem with. All right, so let's see why he had a problem with it. Let's read it. I will now consider the relation with the federal government bears to slavery in the states. Slavery is emphatically a state institution and a ninth section of the first article of the Constitution of the United States. Did y'all hear that? Did y'all hear that? It provides that the migration or the importation of such person as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit should not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1801, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person. So why you think Frederick Douglass was saying what he's saying, was doing what he's doing, was teaching what he was teaching? Why? Because he understand he was subject to the same type of treatment of importation. In the convention, it was proposed by a committee of 11 to limit the importation of slaves to the year 1800, when Mr. Pinckney moved to extend the time to the year 1808. These motions were carried out in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, voting in the affirmative, in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Virginia in the negative. Its opposition to the motion was Mr. Madison, who said, and let's read it. 20 years will produce all the mischief that can be apprehended from the liberty to import slaves. So long a term will be more dishonorable to the American character than to say nothing about it in our Constitution. Okay? It goes on further, it says, in the formation of the federal Constitution, care was taken to confirm no power of federal government to interfere with the institution in the state. And the provisions respecting the slave trade and fixing the ratio of representation, providing for the reclaiming of fugitives from labor, slaves were referred to as persons, and no other respect are they considered in the Constitution, i.e., legal persons. We need not refer to the mercenary spirit which introduced the infamous traffic in slaves to show degradation of Negro slaves in our country. This system was imposed upon our colonial settlement by the mother country, and it is due to truth to say that the commercial colonies and the states were chiefly engaged in the traffic. But we know as historical fact that James Madison, that great and good man, a leading member in the Federal Convention, was solicitous to guard the language of that instrument so as not to convey the idea that there could be property in man. Okay, y'all better listen. Many of our states on the adoption of the Constitution or shortly afterward took measures to abolish slavery within respective jurisdictions. And it is well known fact that a belief was cherished by the leading men, South as well as North, that the institution of slavery would gradually decline until it would become extinct. The increased value of slave labor and the culture of cotton and sugar prevented the realization of this expectation, like all other communities and states. The South were influenced by but what they considered to be their own interests. But if we turn our attention to the dark ages of the world, why confer our bill to colored slaves, question mark, on the same principles white men were made slaves, all slavery had its origin in power and against rights. Okay? This is why Dred Scott took the stand that he did. Why? Let's get another quote before we move out in this case. The article. So it said we turn our attention to the Dark Ages. White people were slaves. So let's go to the Dark Ages. Dark Ages, the term for the early medieval ages or Middle Ages from the 5th to the 10th century. On occasion, the entire Middle Ages from the 5th to the 15th century. In Western Europe, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, which characteristics as marked by economic, intellectual, and cultural decline. The concept of Dark Ages as historiographical periodization originated in the 1330s with the Italian scholar Petrarch, who regarded the post-Roman centuries as dark compared to light of classical antiquity. The term employed traditional light versus darkness, imaginary to contrast the era to suppose darkness, ignorance, and error, the earlier and later period of light, knowledge, and understanding, i.e., enlightenment. Okay? Enlightenment versus in the darkness. And we just seen from the Dred Scott that they were in darkness. Okay? They were in darkness. No, dark ages means light versus darkness, good versus bad, right versus wrong, etc. All right. So let's go back to uh Dred Scott. He said the Dred Scott case represents the lowest point of race and law. Okay, race and law. We already said what Frederick Douglas said about the Church of Scotland in regards to their participation in slavery, which had everything to do with this article we're reading now. Okay, we know we've no reason to think that they ever met. These two 19th century figures were roots in Baltimore. Both Frederick Douglass and Roger Brooke Taney called that city home in 1837 and 1838. The former was an enslaved laborer on the eve of stealing his liberty, while the latter had just recently been appointed Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. While both inhabited the nation's third largest city, Douglass and Taney walked very different streets. All right? Which should be the situation with us. We must walk different streets, all right, in different manner, in a different way, all right, not as Chief Taney thought, as well as all those who support Chief Taney theory on the status as Negro, Black, Honey, Ethiopian, but Frederick Douglass, as well as all those who supported Frederick Douglass based off Frederick Douglass' comprehension level, not just because you just like the man, but based upon his comprehension level. Still, Taney and Douglass knew one another, though not in the they were acquainted, since they knew one another as archetypes that took part in the ongoing struggle over the future of those who managed to throw off slavery shackles, free people of color. Taney understood the lengths of which enslaved people would go to free themselves. He was, for example, party to a transaction in which an enslaved man, Cornelius Thompson, purchased his own liberty in 1832. And of course, Douglas knew how laws shaped the circumstances of the enslaved. In 1845, fugitive memoirs, narrative of a life of Frederick Douglas, he recalled encounters with law from detention in the Eastern Shore jail to exclusion from courtroom that disallowed black testimony against white wrongdoer. This is called a trial by jury. This goes back into what we call the size of court, based upon the Constitution, the size Clarendon Constitution. All right, the size of courts and the Clarendon Constitution. Okay, 1167 and 1166, 1164, all passed by our ancestors. All right, which Frederick Douglass knew. All right. Their confrontation came in 1857 in a battle waged with pen and ink, which is how we're doing it now. By that year, neither called Baltimore home any longer. Taney wrote from Washington, D.C., where he had settled after the death of his wife, his ideas expressed through the United States Supreme Court opinion, case law. Douglas called Western New York Rochester home, living in the heart of a radical reform culture that had also given birth to the first woman right convention. There had published news and commentary in the page of the weekly Frederick Douglass paper. The two faced off over the case of Scott versus Sanford and a disagreement about the standing of Black Americans before the Constitution. It was an old debate, one that had its origin in 1820, where Black American citizens of the United States, or were they more citizens without any claim to protection under the law? This is a question that was posed. All right. This is a question that was posed. The question is then being posed today. Taney denied black citizenship. His March in 1857 opinion, his March 1857 opinion concluded that at the time of the nation's founding, Black Americans had held no right that white men were bound to respect. Taney reasoned that because they had been excluded from the Constitution, vision of that body of politics, i.e., that social contract or that social compact, people, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens of the United States. Y'all better listen to what I'm telling y'all. I'm gonna close that on this one. Douglas took the opposite view, asserting that blackness was no bar to belonging. And in a sense, his reason was a stark as of that of Taney. Douglas viewed his citizenship as self-evident, and he spoke out as a man, an American, a citizen, a colored man of both Anglo-Saxon and African descent. Taney's idea were Douglas pronounced a preservation of the Constitution and a brazen misstatement of the facts of history. He relied upon the Constitution plain language, which make no reference to color or the physical peculiarities of any part of the people of the United States. Douglas continued to assert that no secret and unwritten understanding can be imputed to the founders because such men were not of one mind about the status of the enslaved African race or its future in the United States. Did you hear that, y'all? Did you hear that? All based upon the Dred Scott case. Okay? So let's close out on this article. The Miserable Slave, The Degraded Servant, Frederick Douglass, Anglo-Saxons, and the Mexican War. Annie Abrams, New York University, New York, United States of America. We already read this article in prior classes. I'll read it again just for the sake of the topic. This essay examines Frederick Douglas' use of the term Anglo-Saxon in the context of both American slavery and Anglo-American relations. Douglas' critic perspective on the national narrative about Anglo-Saxons during the Mexican War allowed him to identify loopholes by which he and other Black writers could enter the mainstream American timeline. You hear that? That gap in the timeline, okay? That gap in the chain of title. Romantic Anglo-Saxonism in vogue at the time was already shadowy and open to individuals' interpretation. Douglas isolated two features of the Anglo-Saxonism in this period that were advantageous for his anti-colonizationist agenda. Literacy, a crucial part of the ideology, imperialism, and the temporalities of linear progress. This essay considers that he sought to remove this legacy from exclusive white control. Did you hear that? This man was fighting for us. I'm continuing to fight. I won't have time to go to the whole article, but we will read some of it. As Teller and his troops prepared to defend America's interests to the west, Douglas fled east to protect his own autonomy. Over the next few years, Douglas confronted where America ended, both physically and culturally, and what those limits meant for delineating the nation's identity, his own identity, and relationship between the two. For Douglas, as for Pope and Teller in this period, America was moving toward fulfilling what journalist John L. O'Sullivan called the country's manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of over yearly multiplying millions. Okay, this dealing with the land that was ceded to the United States. All right, Treaty of Paris, 1763, which was west of the East Coast. The exclusionary nature of this concept is clear in O'Sullivan's evidence for the inviolability of California statehood. We already talked about that in Dred Scott case. All right. Already, the advance guard of the irresistible army of Anglo-Saxon immigration had begun to pour down upon it. The popular myth about American Anglo-Saxons traveling west and into the future celebrated an imbalance of power among people living out of a common trajectory at different velocities. As an integrationalist, as an integrationist, Douglas wanted slaves, their owners, free blacks, and non-slave owning whites to understand themselves as traveling along the same course, so engaged with a hegemonic story about the country's destiny despite his abhorrence of its inherited violence. Tracing this engagement exposes a thorny model of dissent in which Douglas simultaneously called attention to the hypercritical historical narrative of the manifest destiny, while also legitimizing the understanding of the appealing Anglo-American temporalities at the core of that ideology. Okay? This article reads Douglas' 1840 speeches, published letters, and articles in which he uses the phrase Anglo-Saxon and considers the term valences in his writings. Douglas expressed in his Douglas expressed in his ambivalence from Vanessa, right, about the patriotism by making explicit the instability and vagrancy surrounding the Anglo-Saxonism, one of the American foundational myths about its identity. Douglas' careful attention to the national story about Anglo-Saxons enabled him to understand as a narrative through which he and other Black people living in America can enter the mainstream timeline of progress. Okay? In particular, on the main Douglas capitalized on the notion that the genealogy had little to do with who could lay claim to Anglo-Saxon identity, and that after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, the Anglo-Saxons were themselves enslaved. Did y'all hear that? Did y'all hear that? This is what Douglas said. Frederick Douglas said, and capitalized on the saying that on the notion that the genealogy had little to do with who could lay claim to the Anglo-Saxon identity, that after the Norman conquest of England, the Anglo-Saxons themselves were enslaved, as said in the Dred Scott case. I didn't read it, but they actually said that. Okay, actually said that. You know, William the Conqueror was the English renowned king who brought in the Jews who are running the show today. All right. They invaded England, not over there, but over here, because Frederick Douglas is speaking on behalf of Anglo-Saxon over here. All right. And the Norman conquest of England over here. All right. Because we know the English overseas possession goes back to Ashton within the Anglo-sphere over here. All right. Douglas acknowledged the advantage of what he saw as two key figures of contemporary Anglo-Saxonism: participation in print culture and the temporality of linear progress while wresting those legacies from exclusively white control at the time when Anglo-Saxonism threatened to shut out non-white Americans from aligning their own personal destinies with their nation. I look to the way Douglas thought about learning to read, write, and publish as a means to combat the meta-narrative of Anglo-Saxonism. In the word of print, Douglas found the self-ownership necessary to take the national folk tale, make it his own, and reinvent it to include Black Americans. This is in the time of slavery, y'all. So he planted the seed. I'm the offshoot of that seed, especially when it's dealing with property. All right? Let me go down a little further right here. While it is surprising to find a big work in this particular magazine, the editor acknowledges Whittier's divisive political and their head note and hope his fine intellectual beauty will be apparent even to the madness political parts of Whittier's divisive politics and their head notes and hope it will find intellectual beauty will be apparent even to the maddest mob that ever raged south of the Potomac. Whittier bitterly remarked on the border dispute with Mexico, the bulldog curiosity of the half-intoxicated Anglo-Saxon, pushing his blind way against the converging cannon fire from the Cuad Rodrigo, commits itself neither to my region nor my fancy. This denunciation of this impending Mexican-American war clarifies one commonality among Democrats and Whigs during the summer of 1845, despite the deepening divide between them. Both parties understood the conflict along the southwest border as one between Anglo-Saxons, the direct descendants of medieval English warriors. Did you hear that? Between Anglo-Saxons, a direct descendant of medieval English warriors. That gets back into what we call the Clovis culture. All right? Yes, the Clovis culture was in Mexico, just like they were found in Pennsylvania. All right? Back in Meadowcraft, which goes back to pre-Clovis. Okay? So it said here, Whigs during the summer of 1845, despite the deepening divide between them, both parties understood the conflict along the southwest border as one between Anglo-Saxons, the direct descendant of the medieval warriors, and Mexicans. You hear that? And you know, the Mexican goes back to the Clovis culture. Y'all better listen to me. These accounts of the conflict in the Southwest are not unique to the review. Indeed, they are representative of reports across sources. It will become clear throughout this essay that even Douglas used his paradigm 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 to talk about the relationship between race and progress in America. Whittier dismisses the providential elements of the Anglo-Saxonism, while O'Sullivan reinforces it. But the rationalized ideology and the sense of inviolability inherent to it is an integral part of the way both understand the war states, i.e., stakeholders. Historians remain conflicted about Polk's motive in pursuing the Mexican War. For the purpose of this article, what matters is not how or why the war happened, but what Douglas thought about these things. While some current historians like Robert Murray would have us believe that slavery had little to do with Polk's aggressive expansion efforts, Douglas insisted in the monarchies and freedom, republic, and slavery. One of the last speeches he delivered in the UK, that the war was a conspiracy from the beginning to the end, a most deep and skillfully devised conspiracy for the purpose of upholding and sustaining one of the darkest and foulest crimes ever committed by men. Did you hear this, y'all? Do y'all hear this? In other words, Douglas argued the war was fought to defend and propagate slavery. He was not alone in this position. Chattel slavery was already in place in Texas when the United States acquired it in 1846, and the admission of slave state to the Union was highly controversial. Between 1840 and 1850, over the course of its transition from the independent republic of state, the slave population of Texas increased from 11,323 to 58,161. The division and ultimate failure of the Wilmot Proviso, a bill drafted in 1846 by the Northern Democrat to prevent the spread of slavery and to the newly acquired territories. Newly acquired territories demonstrate the clear intersection of issues surrounding the spread of peculiar institutions and the Southern Democratic post-imperialism. The relationship between manifest destiny and corollary Anglo-Saxonism, any slave becomes murky in this period. Did you hear that? And Anglo-Saxonism is used not only to justify the domination of Mexicans, but also the subjugation of blacks. Did you hear that? The subjugation of blacks. The Mexican American War was largely supported by Democrats, Northern and Southerns, and opposed by Whigs. Roughly the same line along which slaveholders and anti-slavery activists fell. Whether or not the spread of slavery was at the root of the Mexican War mattered to Douglas not, only because his deep empathy with the enslaved, but because America was actively defining itself at the same time that he was defining himself in relation to it. All things English had positive, inspiring associations for young Douglas, and in foreshadowing of his later relationship to England and the concept of English pedigree, Douglas suggested that as a child he understood the fragrant cheese, golden butter, and delicious cream derived from Lloyd's cows as prestigious sources of sustenance that had their origin from the place he lived. Even if Douglas could not partake of these products in any corporal way, they nourished his sense that faraway places held possibility, hope, in them. And inherited to possibilities and hope was an experience of time that is forward looking. Forward looking is when you come into the story dealing with the white shit. I don't know if you ever heard of the white shit, okay? They come too much. Hmm. Douglas retells the story of Anglo-Saxon America. Douglas' trip to Britain left him with the impression that America was a web of narratives constantly being retold. You hear that? Douglas' trip to Britain left him with the impression that America was a web of narratives constantly being retold. In his farewell to the British people, Douglas said that the fact is the whole system, the entire network of American society is one of the greatest falsehoods from beginning to end. Y'all better listen. Y'all better listen. This was Frederick Douglass said. The American society is one of the greatest falsehoods from beginning to end. Later in the same speech, he said, "We are a nation of inconsistencies, completely made up of inconsistencies." Douglas, 1847, 1950, 1:209. Given Douglas' sense of America as a composite of stories, it is unsurprising that upon his return to the United States, imbued with a new sense of agency, he will become one of the nation's most famous and controversial storytellers as the editor of the North Star. You hear that? He dedicated himself to addressing the nation's inconsistency. All right, it's what we're doing. In the third issue of the paper, Douglas published an article titled "The War of Mexico," in which he explained his anti-war stance. This is the first time Douglas mentioned Anglo-Saxon in the paper. All right, and he did so 4 times over the space of a column and a half. First, he wrote, "Mexico seems a doomed victim to Anglo-Saxon cupidity and love of dominion." So by the second mention, in which Anglo-Saxon blood is one of many cries in favor of the Mexican War, the reader empathy is diminished. The third time Douglas mentioned Saxon is in this article, he mocks Anglo-Saxonism, especially when he wrote, "The main argument in favor of the war was the meanness and wickedness of the Mexican people. The cup of Mexican iniquity was full, and that God was now making us of the Anglo-Saxon race as a rod to chastise them." Did y'all hear that? Did y'all hear that? This is what he talked to the British people. The main argument in favor of the war was the meanness and wickedness of the Mexican people, that the cup of Mexican iniquity was full, and that God was now making us of an Anglo-Saxon race as a rod to chastise them. Douglas, 1848a. By this point in the article, Douglas has clearly established that the war is one between Saxons and Mexicans. In his final mention of Saxony, he flipped Anglo-Saxonism on his head when he wrote that the Mexican people have been reduced to a condition little more than the endured by the Saxons, which were vanquished by the Norman invaders. But so sure as there is a God of justice, we should not be unpunished. We should not go unpunished. The penalty is certain. We cannot escape. A terrible retribution awaits us. Douglas, 1848. For Douglas, the violence of Anglo-Saxonism was hypocritical because it inherently ignored the pain of their own past victimization. Victimization. Though Douglas distanced himself from Saxon in the rest of the article, he was bound up in the retribution that awaits us, not them. This is the first in a series of instances in which Douglas binds himself up with the temporality of the Anglo-Saxons, and so doing so exploits Anglo-Saxonism to suit his goal of expiring an end to the war. Throughout this article, Douglas continually clarifies and sharpens the definition of Anglo-Saxon, and the last mention the hypocrisy of Americans carrying usage crystallized. As I come to my closing, because of the discrepancy between the fact of English history and the American exceptionalism upon which Anglo-Saxons was purportedly built, Douglas had difficulty parsing his sense of American temporality and his own personal timeline from the Anglo-Saxonism that drove the war. He wrote in the Expectoration, published in the North Star, 22nd of December, 1848, that the haughty Normans once looked down upon the degraded and subjugated Anglo-Saxons as an inferior species of a race of men. Did you hear that? How did he know this much about the Normans? Frederick Douglass. All right? As a race of men. The Americans now look down upon the Mexicans as the inferior species of the race of men. And so we suppose it will ever be with successful tyrants, will ever be with successful tyrants. Douglas manipulated the convention and asked readers to reconsider what Anglo-Saxon history really taught Americans about assumptions of racial superiority. This level of remove from the Americans mentioned here makes it seem as though Douglas understood himself as the observer and not a participant in the nation's propagandistic manipulations of history. And yet Douglas understood himself as a participant in the future. As the war ends, Douglas wrote editorial for the North Star that began to distinguish his paper from the other celebrated pieces. Peace. He wrote in peace. Distinguished his paper from Parson. He wrote in peace, peace, peace. We are such an exception to the great mass of our fellow countrymen that we find it difficult to unite with them at this time in their general exaltations. The pronoun here is clear. We are an exception apart from the great mass. And yet by the end of his statement, Douglas put himself back in the company of the war's perpetrators by entreating his readers to crave pardon for our crimes at the hand of God, whose mercy endures forever. This we apart at the beginning of the peace becomes part of the national hour by the end of it. Let me read that again. That we apart at the beginning of the peace becomes part of the national hour by the end of it. Douglas was consistent in expressing that his destiny was contingent on the American Anglo-Saxonism, even while he refused to participate in the ideology manipulation of history. All right? As he wrote in The Destiny of the Colored Americans, an article published in the North Star, the 16th of November, 1849, we deem it a settled point that the destiny of the colored man is bound up with that of the white people of this country. White people of this country. Be the destiny of the latter what it may, you hear that? Be the destiny of the latter, being the white. Douglas capitalized on the Anglo-Saxonism to show that the true heirs to the Saxon legacy as a conquered people were not only Mexicans, as is the examples above, but also Black. In Douglas' view, Blacks had even more of a claim on Anglo-Saxon cultural heritage than Mexicans did, given their common enslavement. For Douglas, Black Americans can understand Anglo-Saxon England as a point of origin. Do y'all hear that? By invoking medieval English history and challenging white members of its origin to think of themselves as oppressive Normans rather than Anglo-Saxons. Douglas participated in vaunting historical Saxons while he called for an end to the Anglo-Saxonist sense of racial superiority. Do you hear that? And the motto for ourselves, this model of the Anglo-Saxon legacy of freedom could be more widely acceptable. In American England, Christopher Hanlon writes, tapping the transatlantic genealogy that has circulated through his national culture since at least 1850, Douglas assumes his white northern audience to regard themselves as the descendants of those Saxon serfs and plums that habit that habit of identification for its further implication. Okay? For its further implication. So there you have it. As you can see, Frederick Douglass is due all the honor, all right, in regards to being what I call a prophet, okay? He truly prophesied what we as a nation of people were to become, all right? Even at the offset of what our people were going through as established in the Dred Scott case. So we really need to take our past and present leaders seriously, because without recognizing them, you won't be recognized as a leader in the future, right? So with that, I say